The Swinging Door. This happened when I was about 8 years old. We had some sort of family occasion one time, and our house was crowded by our family members, relatives, and friends. If I can recall, I feel like it was my baby sister's first birthday. I can't remember. I'm the second child, and my elder brother Bill was just about 2 years older than me. Bill and I were very close, but the thing that annoyed me the most about him was that he had this habit of pulling scary pranks on me. Sometimes he'd sneakily hide at some corner of my room, and when I'd enter, he'd leap out of his hiding spot, scaring the living daylights out of me. Most times I'd cry, but not out loud. Other times I'd just be moody and not talk to him for several hours. He seemed to love scaring me because he knows how I'd react. And to quote his exact word for my scared reaction was priceless, and he would laugh like a bully. Anywho, during that particular occasion, my cousin sister Lawanda and I were upstairs in my sister's playroom and were coloring some pictures with crayons. My whole family were downstairs, dining and feasting, and not a single soul except for Lawanda and I were on the second floor. As we were coloring and talking about kids' TV shows, I remember one of my sister's teddy bears mysteriously fell off the shelf. My cousin and I brushed it aside, thinking it was just coincidental. We continued coloring, and just then a distant giggle could be heard just across the hallway, which sounded like a little girl. Thinking nothing of it, we just assumed it to be one of our cousins, as we were a big family with a lot of kids our age. The giggles continued and only seemed to get closer, until it was just coming from outside the door to my sister's playroom. All of a sudden, the door started to swing open and closing by itself. We were puzzled as the night was calm and there was no wind or even the slightest breeze. Suspecting that it was my brother, Bill, trying to pull a prank on us, I shouted, "We know it's you, Bill. You can stop. It's not funny." But the door kept swinging back and forth, and in a split second, it started swinging even faster. Annoyed and certain that it was my brother, I went to the door and grabbed the handle, pulled it open, and to our surprise, there was no one there. My cousin and I screamed to the top of our lungs and just bolted out of the room and ran for dear life. Upon hearing our screams, my parents and relatives got worried and ran halfway up the stairs. I jumped into my dad and started to explain what had happened with the giggle and the door swinging. But of course they didn't believe us and told us maybe it's just the wind, like any adult reaction in horror movies. Minutes after we've calmed down, I went to my grandma's room and see Bill with a bowl of popcorn watching TV with my other cousins. I told him about the incident, to which he laughed and shoved it off as me trying to get back at him for all those times he scared me. It's been 17 years now, and to this day, Lawanda and I still can't figure out what we experienced that night. Bizarre practices. To be precise, this incident happened before the COVID-19 pandemic, sometime during the winter months of 2018, when the world was free and people could travel just about anywhere. I was about 26 at that time. I love adventure. Also, I'm a freelance photographer who barely stayed indoors. I love nature and would trek to the remotest regions to capture nature's treats. One time, my buddy Ethan and I visited a far-off village, which was located in a small state in the northeastern part of India. The village was famous for their traditional textile weaving. The treasures of this beautiful temperate land and the opportunities for local tribes of the state is immense. Eri is the most respected fabric of the local tribal people of that state. From kings and queens to everyday villager, Eri silk is the fabric worn with most pride. My friend Ethan was a PhD scholar who was working a thesis on the socio-economic aspects of the local tribes of this region, and he would often travel and had encompassed virtually all parts of the region to gather insights for his research. So our visit to the village was not without purpose. Ethan had asked me to come along as he knew I'd never say no to these kind of opportunities. I was driving Ethan's car and the drive took us about 5 hours due to the bad condition of the roads. However, once we reached, our day at the village was fantastic. We got a glimpse of the traditional textile weaving methods and techniques, and I got to capture very rare images of the manufacturing process. The local people were very friendly and filled in every detail to whatever questions Ethan had. By the time we were done, it was already around 5 p.m. and we had to travel a long way back to town. We decided to move out since the locals had warned us about traveling at night in those parts, since they were infested with bandits. The fact that it was just the two of us would be rendered helpless in case of an ambush or a sudden breakdown, as settlements along the road were very rare. A continuous stretch of dense forest enveloped the road, so you can understand why it would be a bad idea to travel these parts after dark. The drive home was a pain as we couldn't pick up speed because of the bumpy road. We constantly kept an eye out and remained vigilant, fearing we might encounter some bandits who would stop us in the middle of the forest and loot us. But to our relief, we didn't encounter any. It was about 8:30 p.m. when we came across signs of civilization, and we felt at ease. We were both hungry, so we were on the lookout for stalls that might still be open, but were unlucky as they were all closed. So we decided to drive ahead in hope of finding one in the next village. We came across a lone shop with dim lights still open in the middle of the forest, and it had a signboard that read "Tea Stall." We decided to pull over and check out what was on the menu. Upon entering, we were greeted by an old couple, probably in their late 70s, and asked us to be seated. Rice was the main dominant cuisine in those parts, so we ordered, along with fish curry. Yum! We were excited as we were very tired and hungry. Ethan was familiar with the local dialect of the area, so he was having a chat with the old couple. The husband kept going to the back of the stall and was talking to who we thought were chefs or cooks, while the old lady was sitting by the stove, preparing tea. However, the old man's manner of conversing seemed very off. It sounded like he was talking to very young children, calling them by their names, particularly Jack and Evie, supervising on how and what to cook, things like boiling rice and adding salt and whatnot. Ethan and I looked at each other and found this bizarre for two reasons. 1. The stall was small and was not attached to any house-like structure. It was just a small hut made of tin, making it unlikely for children to be present, especially at that time of the night in the middle of nowhere. And the second reason was that we never heard any response from so-called Jack and Evie. This raised a red flag, so we devised a plan to move out without alerting the old couple. Ethan stood up and says loudly that he needed to take a leak outside, so he excused himself. A few moments later, I received a text from Ethan asking me to come out quickly. Not wanting to arouse any suspicion, I pretended that I had received a call and answered the fake call outside. Once out, Ethan signals me and we slowly head towards the car. We get in quickly and speed off immediately. I asked Ethan what was wrong and what was it he saw back there. And he tells me that when he was pretending to take care of his business, he peeped in at the back of the stall from a distance and was shocked to see that Jack and Evie were no humans. In fact, they were animals, particularly a rooster and a dog. I know this sounds ridiculous, but from what he described, they were actually obeying and following instructions from the old man. The rooster was pecking grains of rice and actually dropping the grains in the cooking pot, and the dog, supposedly Evie, was boiling water in a kettle and actually pouring the boiling water in the pot with its mouth. I had no doubt that whatever Ethan saw was true. You see, this kind of practice is evident in those parts. My grandparents would narrate similar stories of people who practice black magic or witchcraft, or whatever you like to call it, which involves human-animal interaction in a bizarre way, an interaction which is unearthly and abnormal. Sometimes there would be cases where deceased human beings are reincarnated as animals through these black magic rituals. The Old Lady. Being an only child, when I was growing up, I often stayed at my grandparents' in Salisbury, England, till I was about 9 years old. As both my parents were working in the airlines industry, my dad was a pilot and my mother was a flight attendant. Their job demanded them to travel most of the time, and they were hardly ever at home, so I spent most of my time of the year over at my grandparents'. They lived not too far from our residence, roughly about a 15 to 20 minutes drive. Having spent most of my time here, I grew quite fond of the place and had several friends around the suburban neighborhood. The houses were aligned parallel to each other, a dozen on each row occupied by other families. Save for one, located on the far end of our row, lived an old lady named Mrs. Boyle. Her husband had passed away 7 years prior, and their only child was married and living somewhere across the country with his family. In hindsight, Mrs. Boyle was an old retiree and had been living by herself and never mingled much with anyone around the neighborhood following her husband's death. She would often lock herself up in her room and look through her window. Her house was an old Victorian-style structure, old and decaying with paints wearing off. The old willow tree by the house just made it all the more creepier. Unsuspecting passerby would often be freaked out when they spotted her staring through the window. Me and my friends, Tenny, Mike, and Tim, would often play around across the neighborhood, and we'd usually ride our bikes to the playground, located over at the far end, and we had to pass by the old lady's place to get there. We'd pedal faster, dashing across that old house, but while at it, we would still sense and feel uneasy as we passed by. During one summer, Tim and Mike had joined a week-long summer camp. Despite their absence, Tenny and I would still go over to the playground. One evening, Tenny's elder sister came by the playground to pick him up, saying that their uncle wasn't doing well and that they had to go over for a visit. Once they left, I took my bike and headed home as it was getting dark. Upon closing in on the old lady's house, I pedaled faster but failed to notice the little pothole in front, which caused me to crash my bike at the old lady's mailbox. A bit shaken, I got up. As I reached for my bike, I hear a grumpy voice saying, "Are you hurt, my child?" I turned around and was unnerved to see the old lady towering above me. She reached out to my arm and I instinctively moved away, but saw her pointing at my bruised elbow, which was now beginning to sting. "Poor child," as she says with a tone of concern in her voice as she bends down to inspect my wound. As the pain from the cut was getting worse, she then asked me to follow her inside, telling me not to worry with a reassuring smile. A bit hesitant at first, I gradually followed her, a bit surprised to see that the house was well lit compared to the other days. Upon entering, I noticed music playing through an old record player from the doorway of the other room. She heads towards her kitchen and opens one of the cabinet doors and grabs a first aid kit. She tended to my wound, applying antiseptic and bandaging it. To make me feel better, she treats me some brownies that she'd bake, which I ate heartily. Contrary to what other people thought about Mrs. Boyle, she was really kind. Upon leaving, I took a quick glance at the other room where the music was coming from and caught a short glimpse of someone seated on a lounge chair facing the other way. Thinking nothing of it, I headed out the door and thanked her and bid her good night. I made it to the driveway. As I got on my bike and prepared to leave, I noticed a car pulling over. It was my parents who were home for the week. They've been worried sick and were out searching for me as I'd usually be home by sunset. Then I tell them what had happened, and as I was explaining, I turned towards the house and was shocked to see that all the lights had been turned off and it was now completely dark. Not buying into my story and thinking I was just making up excuses, they tell me to get in as my dad puts my bike in the trunk. Once we reach home, my mom inspects my wound, and they both realize that I was in fact telling the truth, so they made a point to visit and thank Mrs. Boyle the following morning. The next morning, I noticed my dad feeling a bit uneasy and having a discussion with my mom upon his return from Mrs. Boyle's. Not wanting to tell me the truth, they told me that Mrs. Boyle had moved away to some other place. Fast forward to 10 years. We were now living in Bristol, and my parents and I decided to visit our grandparents during the holidays. And as we drove through the neighborhood, we discovered a small convenience store had been built on the same grounds where Mrs. Boyle's house once stood. It was then that my parents finally told me what really happened that day. Apparently that morning when my dad went over to Mrs. Boyle, he found the place packed with cops. A neighbor had supposedly called the authorities, complaining about a foul stench that's been coming for 2 days. Upon investigating, authorities discovered the rotting corpse of Mrs. Boyle on her lounge chair. There was no sign of a break-in or a crime. Furthermore, forensics suggested that she had died of her heart failure, and her lifeless body remained there rotting as she rarely had visitors to discover her corpse. I was terrified to hear that, as I could still vividly remember seeing and talking to her as she tended to my wound. But then I succumbed to a sense of sadness for her. as no one should ever lead such a lonely life. A scar still remains just above my elbow, a stark reminder of the event that had unfolded on that fateful evening. And yet the question still remains to this day. Who or what was it that I had encountered on that fateful evening?